September 1st, 2001, fell on a Saturday. For the purpose of setting the scene, we look to the preceding day, Friday, August 31st. It was a day like any other for most Americans. The sun rose on a nation at peace. Children were preparing for the final days of summer vacation or had just returned to school. Adults went about their daily routines, commuting to work, planning for the weekend, and looking forward to the upcoming Labor Day holiday. There was no sense of impending dread. The concerns of the day were personal and immediate. The grand, sweeping forces of history felt very far away indeed. The nation was not on high alert. This profound sense of normalcy is perhaps the most poignant aspect of that particular day, in stark contrast to what was to come. It was the last day of an era, though nobody knew it, floating serenely towards the sharp point of history that awaited it just 10 days in the future. In September 2001, America enjoyed prosperity and global influence. The Cold War was over. The dot-com boom reshaped the economy, infusing the culture with technological optimism. The country saw itself as a beacon of stability. This feeling of security was deeply ingrained. Terrorism was something that happened elsewhere. The oceans were vast protective moats. The idea of a foreign enemy striking iconic cities seemed like a movie plot. The cultural landscape reflected this mood. The national conversation revolved around celebrity gossip and sporting events. It was a time of personal introspection. Beneath this surface, the world was changing. Forces were gathering strength in remote training camps. The nation was sleepwalking towards a brutal awakening. The sense of security was an illusion. To understand September 1st, 2001, one must look at the world stage. The United States was the sole superpower. Russia was grappling with the collapse of the Soviet Union. China was undergoing economic transformation. The Middle East was a region of simmering discontent, creating fertile ground for extremist ideologies. In Afghanistan, the Taliban provided a safe haven for groups like Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who had already declared war on the United States. These threats were underestimated. This global landscape formed the backdrop for the events about to unfold. The stage was set, and the terrible script was about to be performed. The year 2001 marked the beginning of a new century, filled with both hope and anxiety. The Y2K fears had passed, leaving behind technological optimism as the internet rapidly transformed daily life. Yet this was tinged with economic uncertainty as the dot-com bubble burst and a recession loomed. Culturally, a generation searched for purpose in a world without a defining conflict, filling the void with consumerism. These feelings defined the national mood, unaware of the violent external challenge that awaited. Even in the summer of 2001, the threat was not entirely invisible. Intelligence reports pointed to a significant attack being planned by Al-Qaeda. Phrases like 0 hour and big event were being intercepted, but the specifics remained elusive. The intelligence community knew something was coming, but they did not know what, where, or when. This led to a presidential daily briefing on August 6th titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in US," mentioning possible hijackings. The men who would carry out the attacks were already in the United States, living quiet lives. They enrolled in flight schools, careful to avoid drawing attention. It was a small group of fanatics who exploited the freedoms of the society they intended to attack. Their weapon was a commercial airliner filled with innocent people. The whispers were on the wind, but for most the air was still and silent. By September 1st, 2001, all 19 hijackers were in the US, finalizing their plan in plain sight. Airport security was lax. Box cutters were allowed, cockpit doors were flimsy, and no one imagined planes as weapons. Ordinary Americans went about their lives unaware of the looming threat. The stage was set for tragedy, with vulnerabilities unaddressed and the world oblivious. 10 days remained before everything changed. September 11th dawned clear and calm across the East Coast. A perfect, ordinary Tuesday. Millions followed their routines: coffee, commutes, school drop-offs and work. New York held a mayoral primary. The news was mundane, the mood peaceful. No one sensed the coming storm. Every small act that morning would soon carry unimaginable weight. The day's serenity was the last of its kind. 19 men, spread across hotels in Boston, Newark and DC, prepared for their mission with chilling precision. Dressed to blend in, they carried permitted box cutters and fake bombs, passing through security unnoticed. The system saw only ordinary travelers, not the threat they posed. Their calm, methodical actions exposed fatal gaps in airport security. As they waited to board, disaster was moments away. 4 cross-country flights chosen for their fuel loads became the targets. Passengers and crew were everyday people. Business travelers, families, professionals, all unsuspecting. The hijackers sat among them, ready to strike once airborne. Flight crews were experienced, but nothing in their training prepared them for what was coming. In minutes, routine journeys would become part of history. Lower Manhattan bustled as usual. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline. Workers, tourists and locals filled the towers and streets, immersed in daily life. The World Trade Center was a symbol, taken for granted, seemingly permanent. News focused on politics and weather, no hint of disaster. In a few hours, the city's heart would be forever changed. At the Pentagon, thousands began another day of routine work, confident in the building's security. Meetings, briefings and paperwork filled the morning. No one imagined an attack. Ironically, the soon-to-be-hit section had just been reinforced against terrorism. The staff, military and civilian, were focused on their duties, unaware of the threat approaching. The world's most secure command center was about to become a target. In Washington, D.C., September 11th began with political routine. President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, to promote education initiatives, including a visit to Emma E. Booker Elementary School. For the president and staff, it was a standard trip, far from urgent matters of national security. Back in Washington, the White House operated normally. The government's highest levels were not on a war footing. The president's location in Florida is a crucial detail. The image of the president being informed in a classroom would become one of the most enduring images of the day. No one expected the largest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Across the vast expanse of the United States, the morning of September 11th unfolded in millions of different yet similar ways. In the Midwest, farmers were already in their fields, taking advantage of the good weather. In the Rocky Mountain states, the sun was just beginning to climb over the peaks. On the West Coast, most people were still asleep, their day yet to begin. It was a nation connected by television, radio and the internet, but still living in different time zones, experiencing the morning at a different pace. The shared national experience of the day had not yet begun. It was still a collection of countless individual local mornings. The news of the day was dominated by mundane stories. The economy remained a primary focus, with ongoing discussions about a potential recession. Michael Jordan's rumored return to professional basketball was a major topic of conversation on sports radio shows. Entertainment news covered the latest movie releases and celebrity gossip. Local news broadcasts provided traffic and weather updates to commuters. There was no single unifying story capturing the nation's attention. The concerns of the American public were disparate and largely personal, reflecting a nation at peace with itself and the world. This sense of an ordinary morning was perhaps most pronounced in the places furthest from the East Coast. In California, alarms had not yet gone off. In Texas, people were just beginning their commute. The events that were about to transpire in New York and Washington would initially feel distant, like another news story from a faraway place. The full emotional and psychological impact would take time to ripple across the country, to transform a local catastrophe into a national trauma. The nation was a sleeping giant, and its awakening would be rude, violent, and utterly transformative. The collective memory of the morning of 9/11 is now one of horror and disbelief. But it is crucial to remember the moments just before. The innocence of those hours is what makes the subsequent events so shocking. The day did not begin with fear or foreboding. It began with coffee, with school buses, with morning commutes. It began with the simple, unstated assumption that the day would be like the one before it and that the world was a fundamentally safe and, predictable place. This assumption, held by nearly 300 million people, was about to be proven tragically and catastrophically wrong. At 8:13 a.m., air traffic controllers lost radio contact with American Airlines Flight 11. The plane's transponder was turned off, a sign that something was terribly wrong. On board, 5 hijackers, led by Mohammed Atta, attacked. Armed with box cutters, they gained access to the cockpit, likely killing the pilots. Flight attendants Betty Ong and Madeline Sweeney made calls to American Airlines, reporting the hijacking. Ong's call provided crucial real-time intelligence, including the hijackers' seat numbers. At 8:24 a.m., a transmission from Mohammed Atta mistakenly keyed the radio saying, "We have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay." The phrase, "we have some planes," sent a shockwave, suggesting a coordinated attack and an unprecedented national security threat. As air traffic controllers and airline officials were scrambling to understand the situation aboard Flight 11, a second crisis began to unfold. At approximately 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, which had also departed from Boston, began to deviate from its assigned flight path to Los Angeles. The crew stopped responding to radio calls from air traffic control. Just a few minutes later, the aircraft's transponder signal was changed twice, and then the device was turned off entirely at 8:46 a.m. The controllers at the FAA's New York Center watched on their screens as another Boeing 767 went rogue, a sickeningly familiar pattern repeating itself. On board Flight 175, a similar violent takeover was underway. The 5 hijackers, led by Marwan al-Shehi, assaulted the crew and forced their way into the cockpit. Passengers were herded to the back of the plane. In the midst of the terror, several passengers and a flight attendant managed to make phone calls to family members and authorities on the ground. A passenger named Peter Hansen, traveling with his wife and young daughter, called his father. He reported, "I think they've taken over the cockpit. An attendant has been stabbed. I think we are going down. I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building." Another passenger, Brian Sweeney, left a heart-wrenching voicemail for his wife, Julie. "Jules, this is Brian. Listen, I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. If things don't go well and it's not looking good, I just want you to know I absolutely love you." These calls, made in the final minutes of their lives, provided a harrowing real-time narrative of the events inside the aircraft. They also confirmed the worst fears of the authorities on the ground. A second commercial airliner was now under the control of terrorists, and its new flight path was taking it directly towards the dense urban landscape of New York City. The simultaneous hijacking of 2 large passenger jets was an event without precedent. The protocols for responding to such a crisis were being written in the moment. While officials from the FAA and the airlines were struggling to gather information, the first hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 11, was now just moments away from its target. The second anomaly, Flight 175, was following close behind. The morning of September 11th had transitioned from a state of ordinary calm to one of confusion and alarm. Cheers! At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the serene blue sky over Lower Manhattan was violently torn apart. American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors, instantly killing everyone on board and hundreds inside. A massive fireball erupted, followed by thick black smoke. The sound echoed through the financial district, startling millions. For those on the ground, it was a moment of profound shock. Debris rained down, forcing people to run for cover. Inside, the impact severed stairwells, trapping those above, and ignited jet fuel, creating an intense inferno. Below, a desperate evacuation began. For the world watching on television, this was the start of a dreadful tragedy. Within seconds, news spread rapidly. News helicopters turned their cameras toward the disaster in Lower Manhattan. The first televised images were astonishing, showing a gaping wound in one of the world's most recognizable buildings. News anchors struggled to make sense of it. Across the nation and around the world, people gathered around television sets as the ordinary morning came to a halt. The initial shock was followed by a dawning sense of dread. The world was watching, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. This period, lasting just 17 minutes, was a moment of global suspense, united by a shared sense of shock and concern. Above the impact zone, escape was impossible. Stranded in a cage of smoke and fire, people made calls, saying last goodbyes. A horrific tragedy unfolded on live television. Driven to the windows, they became silhouetted figures against fire and smoke. Faced with an unthinkable choice, some made a desperate decision. Individuals began to fall from the tower. These moments were unforgettable for witnesses. Their plight represents one of the most tragic elements of September 11th. Their final acts speak to a level of human suffering that is difficult to fathom. In the moments after the first impact, New York City's emergency response systems activated on an unprecedented scale. Firefighters, police and Port Authority officers converged on the World Trade Center. The first firefighters faced a nightmarish scene, a massive high-rise fire, falling debris and injured civilians. Firefighters began climbing the tower stairs to fight the fire and evacuate thousands, moving against a tide of panicked civilians. This flow of humanity became a defining image of courage. Police and paramedics worked frantically on the ground. Communication systems were overloaded, hampering response efforts. The first responders ran towards the burning tower without hesitation, driven by their duty to save lives, unaware of the true danger. This selfless courage would define the spirit of the day. At 9:03 in the morning, as the world watched the burning North Tower, the unthinkable happened again. Live television captured United Airlines Flight 175 banking sharply. Watched by millions, the plane slammed into the South Tower, triggering another massive explosion. The second impact erased any hope that the first crash had been an accident. It was a deliberate, coordinated attack. The impact was visually dramatic, creating a colossal fireball seen for miles. Debris rained down onto the streets, now filled with first responders and evacuees. The second impact plunged the South Tower into a desperate fight for survival. Stairwell A remained passable, becoming a critical lifeline for those above the impact. The moment the second plane struck the South Tower, the psychological landscape of the nation was irrevocably altered. The event transformed from a shocking local disaster into a national crisis. In Sarasota, Florida, President George W. Bush was seated in a second-grade classroom when his Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, leaned in and whispered in his ear, "A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." The president's expression, a fleeting look of grim resolve, was captured by the cameras in the room and became an enduring image of the day. Across the country, the reality of the situation began to set in with chilling speed. The Federal Aviation Administration took an unprecedented step. For the first time in American history, it ordered all civilian aircraft to land at the nearest airport as soon as possible. This national ground stop affected thousands of flights, turning the nation's busy air corridors silent. The sight of planes being diverted created a profound sense of unease, a tangible sign that the country was now on a war footing. The realization of being under attack triggered a shift in the public mood from shock to fear. If two planes could be used as weapons in New York, where else might an attack occur? Major landmarks and government buildings were suddenly seen as potential targets. In cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, iconic buildings were evacuated. Theme parks closed. The sense of safety that had long defined the American experience had been shattered in just 17 minutes. The homeland was no longer a sanctuary. This dawning realization was a collective national trauma experienced simultaneously by millions. People called their families not just to check on their safety, but to connect in a moment of shared fear and uncertainty. The normal business of the day was abandoned. Everyone remained glued to their television screens, watching the horrific events unfold, waiting for news, and fearing what might come next. A new and terrible chapter in American history had begun, written in fire and smoke against the New York sky. While the world's attention was riveted on the unfolding horror in New York City, the third element of the coordinated attack was nearing its target. American Airlines Flight 77, which had departed from Dulles International Airport, had been hijacked shortly after takeoff. Its transponder was turned off at 8:56 in the morning, and it disappeared from civilian radar screens. For nearly 30 minutes, the plane flew undetected back towards Washington, D.C. It performed a difficult high-speed descending turn before lining up its final target, the Pentagon, the very symbol of American military power and the nerve center of its national defense. At 9:37 in the morning, Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon at approximately 530 miles per hour. The impact was devastating, killing all 64 people on board the aircraft and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building. The reinforced, recently renovated section of the building absorbed some of the impact. But the plane penetrated deep into the structure's C-ring, creating a massive fireball and a chain reaction of destruction. The crash sent a tremor through the enormous building and started a raging fire fueled by thousands of gallons of jet fuel, which produced thick, acrid smoke that could be seen for miles. The attack on the Pentagon brought the war directly to the heart of the nation's capital and its military establishment. Unlike the strikes on the World Trade Center, which were symbols of economic power, this was a direct assault on the Department of Defense. The news of this third attack, coming just over 30 minutes after the second tower was hit, deepened the sense of national crisis. It confirmed that the assault was widespread and meticulously planned, targeting the country's financial, political, and military centers. The United States government itself was now under direct physical assault, a scenario previously confined to disaster movies and military thrillers. The response at the Pentagon was immediate and heroic. Military personnel and civilian employees who had just survived the blast immediately began rescue efforts, pulling injured colleagues from the wreckage and smoke-filled offices, often at great personal risk. Emergency responders from Arlington County and surrounding jurisdictions rushed to the scene to battle the intense fire and begin the grim task of search and rescue. The attack on the Pentagon was a profound psychological blow, demonstrating that not even the most fortified symbol of American strength was immune from this new and audacious enemy. The nation's capital was a war zone. In the chaotic minutes following the first hijacking, the standard protocols for military intervention were set in motion. NORAD was alerted about 20 minutes after Flight 11 went silent. 2 F-15 fighter jets were scrambled from Otis Air National Guard Base. The system had been designed for a Cold War scenario, not to respond to domestic commercial airliners that had suddenly turned into weapons. After the Pentagon was hit, the urgency to intercept Flight 93 became paramount. Vice President Dick Cheney authorized the military to shoot down any hijacked airliner. F-16 fighter jets were scrambled to patrol the skies. Pilots now found themselves flying over American cities, hunting for weaponized civilian airliners. United Airlines Flight 93 had departed late from Newark, a delay that would prove critical. The hijacking began after the towers in New York had been struck. Passengers learned about the attacks through courageous phone calls. They understood their flight was a suicide mission and decided to fight back. Realizing their plane was a missile aimed at Washington, D.C., they stormed the cockpit. A violent struggle ensued, captured by the cockpit voice recorder. At 10:03, Flight 93 crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Their heroic actions prevented a greater catastrophe at the intended target. They fought the first counter-offensive in the war on terror, and they won. On the ground in New York, the focus of the fire department's efforts had shifted to the South Tower after it was struck. The fire, though intense, was lower down, and there was hope that at least one stairwell was passable for evacuation. However, the tower had suffered a more glancing but structurally critical blow. The impact had compromised key support columns, and the ensuing fire was relentlessly weakening the remaining steel infrastructure. The building, which had stood for less than an hour after being hit, was failing. At 9:59 in the morning, just 56 minutes after the impact, the unthinkable became reality. The South Tower began to collapse. The floors above the impact zone pancaked downwards, one on top of the other, in a terrifyingly rapid sequential failure. The immense weight of the falling floors gathered momentum, creating a destructive force that the lower, undamaged part of the building simply could not withstand. In the space of about 10 seconds, the entire 110-story skyscraper disintegrated into a massive, rolling cloud of pulverized concrete, steel, and dust. The collapse was a seismic event, registering on earthquake monitors and unleashing a destructive force that obliterated everything in its immediate vicinity. For those watching on television, the sight was surreal and frankly incomprehensible. A building that had been a permanent fixture of the New York skyline simply vanished from sight into a roiling cloud. For those on the ground, it was an apocalyptic event. The collapse sent a colossal pyroclastic-like cloud of toxic dust and debris rushing through the streets of Lower Manhattan, enveloping everything and everyone in its path. People ran for their lives, seeking shelter in building lobbies and subway entrances as the sky turned black as night and the air became unbreathable. The collapse of the South Tower was a devastating blow to the rescue effort. Hundreds of people, including many firefighters and police officers who were inside or near the tower, were killed instantly. The command post in the North Tower lobby was now in extreme peril, and the collapse severed many of the remaining communication lines, adding to the chaos. The fall of the first tower signified a horrifying new phase of the disaster. The attack was no longer just about fire and evacuation. It was a structural catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. And its twin, the North Tower, was still standing, burning and dangerously weakened. After the collapse of its twin, the North Tower stood alone, a wounded giant. It had endured the impact for 102 minutes. First responders were ordered to evacuate, knowing a second collapse was inevitable. At 10:28 a.m., the antennas began to sink. The collapse began, mirroring the South Tower, and the structure imploded downwards. A colossal cloud of debris surged through Manhattan. The fall of the North Tower marked the devastating climax in New York City. In its place was a mountain of smoking rubble. The heart of New York's financial district had been transformed into ground zero. The attacks had ended, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. As the dust cloud settled, it revealed utter ruin. The site was now a vast, smouldering pile of twisted steel and pulverized concrete. The scale of destruction was breathtaking. Lower Manhattan streets vanished beneath a thick blanket of dust, transforming the area into a silent alien moonscape. The air was thick with the smell of burning jet fuel and other toxic materials. Rescue workers found themselves in a surreal world. Firefighters and police officers, coated in dust, stumbled through the wreckage. The sounds of the city were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crackle of fires. The area around the World Trade Center was a scene of apocalyptic damage. Buildings were shattered and coated in dust. The 7 World Trade Center was heavily damaged and burning uncontrollably. The streets were littered with debris, creating a heartbreaking tableau of interrupted lives. This landscape of devastation, soon known as Ground Zero, was a mass grave. With the nation's capital and its largest city under direct assault, the United States government initiated a response of unprecedented scale and urgency. After his brief, unsettling appearance at the Florida elementary school, President Bush was taken aboard Air Force One. For security reasons, the presidential aircraft did not immediately return to Washington, D.C. Instead, it ascended to a high altitude and flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana and later to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the United States Strategic Command. This was to ensure the continuity of government, protecting the president from what was feared to be an ongoing wave of attacks. From the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, deep beneath the White House, Vice President Dick Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice coordinated the immediate government response. They established a secure video conference with key officials, including the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, at the Pentagon. The primary objective was to secure the nation's airspace and understand the full scope of the attack. The order to ground all civilian aircraft was a critical first step. The military was placed on high alert, and fighter jets patrolled the skies over Washington and New York, a visible and reassuring sign of a government reasserting control. Across the country, federal buildings were evacuated and secured. The Secret Service implemented its highest level of protection for all government leaders. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, was activated to coordinate the federal response to the disaster sites in New York and Virginia, preparing to deploy its urban search and rescue teams. In those chaotic hours, the vast machinery of the federal government, while shaken, began to move with purpose. Lines of communication, though strained, were established, and a clear chain of command was solidified to manage the unfolding crisis on multiple fronts. From Barksdale Air Force Base, President Bush delivered his first brief address to the nation that afternoon. He spoke of the national tragedy and assured the American people that the government would hunt down and punish those folks who committed this act. His words, delivered from a secure military location, underscored the gravity of the situation. The government was in motion not just to respond to the immediate disaster, but to prepare for a new kind of war. The gears of national security, defense and emergency management were grinding into action, setting the stage for the long and complex response that would define the coming days, months and years. At Ground Zero, the immediate aftermath of the collapses was defined by a single desperate mission: the search for survivors. Despite the sheer scale of the destruction, there was just a sliver of hope that individuals might have survived in voids or pockets within the massive debris pile. Thousands of rescue workers, firefighters, police officers, construction workers and volunteers converged on the site, forming impromptu bucket brigades to begin the monumental task of clearing the wreckage by hand. They worked in silence, listening intently for any sound, any sign of life beneath the tangled steel and crushed concrete. The conditions for this search were extraordinarily dangerous. The rubble pile was unstable and treacherous, laced with sharp metal and other hazards. Fires continued to burn deep within the wreckage, some reaching temperatures hot enough to melt steel, creating underground infernos that would smoulder for more than 3 months. The air was filled with a toxic cocktail of dust, asbestos and other hazardous materials. And yet, despite the risks, the rescuers worked with a frantic intensity, driven by the hope of finding their missing colleagues and the civilians who had been trapped in the towers. For the first few hours and into the night, the search yielded a few miraculous rescues. A handful of survivors were pulled from the wreckage of the North Tower's lobby and the surrounding areas. Port Authority police officers Will Jimeno and John McLaughlin were found alive, but pinned deep within the debris, their rescue becoming an epic hours-long ordeal. Each survivor found was a moment of profound joy and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, fueling the rescuers to continue their grueling work against overwhelming odds. These early successes, however, were tragically few and far between. As the hours turned into a long and grueling day, the grim reality of the situation began to set in. The moments of hopeful silence, punctuated by calls of quiet to listen for survivors, were increasingly met with more silence. The race against time was a losing battle. The sheer force of the collapses had made survival for anyone caught within them nearly impossible. The mission slowly and heartbreakingly began to shift from one of search and rescue to one of search and recovery. The hope of finding the living gave way to the solemn, sacred duty of finding the dead. While the heroic efforts at Ground Zero continued, the rest of New York City was a metropolis in a state of profound shock and paralysis. With all bridges and tunnels into and out of Manhattan closed to civilian traffic, the island was effectively sealed off. Hundreds of thousands of people who had been evacuated from their offices in lower and midtown Manhattan began a long, slow exodus on foot. A vast, silent river of humanity flowed north up the avenues and across the bridges to Brooklyn and Queens. A mass migration of dazed and dust-covered people just trying to get home. The human toll of the attacks extended far beyond the immediate victims. Hospitals across the city braced for a massive wave of casualties that, for the most part, never arrived. The nature of the event was cruelly binary. People either escaped with relatively minor injuries or they perished in the collapses. This lack of seriously injured survivors was, honestly, a chilling testament to the lethality of the attacks. Instead of treating the wounded, medical personnel and volunteers found themselves waiting. A grim vigil, that only deepened the city's collective sense of loss as the day wore on. In the neighborhood surrounding the World Trade Center, the scene was one of chaos and compassion. Residents opened their doors to strangers, offering water, phones to call loved ones, and a place to wash the dust from their faces. Makeshift triage centers and aid stations sprang up on street corners. The city's famous grit and resilience began to show through the shock. Strangers helped strangers, and a powerful sense of shared community and solidarity emerged from the dust and confusion. New Yorkers were united in their grief and their determination to support one another through the darkest day in their city's history. The search for the missing began almost immediately. Friends and family members who could not contact their loved ones began a desperate search. They converged on hospitals and armories, clutching photographs and hoping for news. In the days that followed, impromptu memorials covered in missing posters would spring up across the city, most notably at Union Square and outside Bellevue Hospital. Each flyer, with its smiling photograph and desperate plea for information, was a small personal story of love and loss, contributing to a vast public monument of collective heartbreak that testified to the immense human cost of the day's events. See, in Arlington, Virginia, the scene at the Pentagon was one of controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the sprawling devastation in New York. While the attack had been horrific, the damage was more localized, and the response was managed with military precision. The building itself, a fortress by design, had withstood the impact without a catastrophic collapse. Firefighters from Arlington County and surrounding jurisdictions battled the intense jet fuel-fed blaze for hours, working alongside military personnel to bring the fire under control and prevent its spread to other sections of the vast complex. The search and rescue operation at the Pentagon was a somber and methodical affair. The impact had caused a partial collapse of the building's outer rings, creating a dangerous and unstable environment for the rescue teams. Military personnel who had been working in the building just moments before the attack now found themselves sifting through the wreckage of their own offices, searching for their colleagues. The work was emotionally taxing and physically dangerous, as rescuers navigated smoke-filled corridors and structurally compromised sections of the building. The human cost at the Pentagon was significant. 125 people inside the building, a mix of military officers and civilian employees, lost their lives. They were accountants, analysts, administrative assistants, and high-ranking naval officers, all public servants at their posts. Their loss sent a shockwave through the tight-knit community of the Department of Defense. Unlike the anonymous tragedy of the World Trade Center, the victims at the Pentagon were known colleagues, their empty desks and chairs a painful and immediate reminder of the attack's toll. Despite the attack on its nerve center, the United States military continued to function. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who had been in his office on the opposite side of the building, famously went to the crash site to help with the rescue efforts before returning to manage the national military response. The Pentagon, though wounded, was not disabled. The survival of its leadership and the continuation of its operations sent a powerful message of resilience. The nation's capital had been attacked, its military headquarters struck, but its government and defense establishment was still standing, defiant and operational. The news of the attack spread across the globe with stunning speed, provoking a nearly universal wave of shock, horror and condemnation. World leaders from every continent issued immediate statements denouncing the acts as barbaric and expressing solidarity with the American people. In Europe, traffic came to a standstill as people gathered in public squares to watch the events unfold on giant screens. The French newspaper Le Monde published a now famous headline, "Nous sommes tous Américains." We are all Americans, capturing the profound sense of shared grief and outrage. Across the world, spontaneous vigils and memorials appeared. In London, the Queen authorised the playing of the American national anthem during the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, a deeply moving and unprecedented gesture. In Berlin, thousands gathered at the Brandenburg Gate, a symbol of Cold War division, now a site of unity and sympathy. Even in nations with complex relationships with the United States, such as Russia and China, governments expressed condolences and condemned terrorism in the strongest terms. For a brief, powerful moment, the world seemed united in its shared humanity. This outpouring of international support was a crucial element of the day's response. It provided comfort to a grieving nation and laid groundwork for international coalitions. The attacks were seen not just as an assault on America, but as an assault on democratic societies everywhere. Leaders from NATO countries invoked Article 5 for the first time in history, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. However, the global reaction was not entirely uniform. In a few corners of the world, most notably in parts of the Middle East, there were televised images of small groups celebrating. These images were deeply shocking to Americans and highlighted the anti-American sentiment that fueled the attackers. This different reaction served as a grim reminder of the complex and divided world in which the attacks had taken place. Even as the dust was still settling over Ground Zero, a massive and urgent investigation was launched by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The central question was no longer just what had happened, but who was responsible. The first crucial clues came from the attack sites themselves. The passenger manifests for the 4 hijacked flights provided the names of the 19 hijackers. Investigators quickly began to trace their movements, discovering that many had entered the country legally and had been living in the United States for months, taking flight lessons and preparing for their deadly mission. Crucial evidence was also recovered from unexpected sources. A piece of luggage belonging to Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the operation, failed to make the connecting flight from Portland, Maine, to Boston. Inside, investigators found a handheld electronic flight computer, a flight simulator video, and a letter in Arabic containing final instructions for the hijackers on their suicide mission. This discovery provided a direct window into the mindset and planning of the attackers, and it contained names that allowed the FBI to quickly link the various cells of the conspiracy together. The investigation rapidly pointed towards one primary suspect, Al-Qaeda, the global terrorist network led by the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden. United States intelligence agencies had been tracking Al-Qaeda for years and were aware of its sophisticated planning and its deep-seated hatred for the United States. The 1998 embassy bombings in Africa and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole had already demonstrated the group's capabilities and its murderous intent. The scale, coordination, and suicidal nature of the September 11th attacks were all hallmarks of an Al-Qaeda operation. Within hours of the attacks, United States intelligence officials were briefing the president and his senior advisors with high confidence that Al-Qaeda was behind the plot. This rapid identification of the enemy was a critical turning point in the day's events. It transformed the response from a domestic disaster recovery effort into the opening phase of a global conflict. The enemy now had a name and a face. The target for the nation's anger and its inevitable military response was coming into focus, located in the remote, mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden and his network enjoyed the protection of the Taliban regime. As evening fell on September 11th, President George W. Bush returned to a wounded but defiant Washington, D.C. He landed at the White House on Marine One and walked across the South Lawn, a symbolic act of reassurance to the nation. That evening at 8:30, he addressed the American people from the Oval Office. His speech was a pivotal moment, aiming to comfort a grieving nation while simultaneously expressing its resolve. He spoke of the evil, despicable acts of terror, paid tribute to the victims and heroes, and made it clear that the United States would respond forcefully. The president's most powerful message was a call for unity. He declared, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." He drew a clear line between the terrorists and the vast majority of Muslims, stating that the United States was at war with a specific network of extremists, not with the religion of Islam. His words sought to channel the nation's raw emotions of anger and grief into a sense of shared purpose and national unity. Across the country, Americans responded to this call. Spontaneous displays of patriotism and unity emerged in communities large and small. People lined up for hours to donate blood. They gathered for impromptu prayer vigils in churches, synagogues and mosques. American flags, which had been stored away in closets, were suddenly flying from every house, overpass and car antenna. In a nation often defined by its political and cultural divisions, the attacks forged a powerful, if temporary, sense of common identity and shared destiny. For a time there were no Democrats or Republicans, there were only Americans. This wave of national unity was a crucial part of the immediate response. It provided the social and emotional foundation for the difficult tasks that lay ahead. The sense of a nation standing together, shoulder to shoulder, provided comfort to the grieving and strength to the weary. In Washington, members of Congress from both parties gathered on the steps of the United States Capitol. In a spontaneous and unscripted moment, they stood together and sang "God Bless America." The sound of their voices, broadcast across the nation, was a poignant symbol of a government and a people united in the face of an unprecedented national trauma. As September 11th, 2001 drew to a close, a new and unsettling quiet descended upon the nation. The skies, normally crisscrossed with the white contrails of commercial airliners, were eerily empty and silent. At Ground Zero in New York and at the Pentagon in Virginia, powerful searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the smoke and dust that still rose from the smouldering ruins. The frantic pace of the day's events gave way to the long, grueling and somber work of recovery, a task that would continue for many months. The day of terror had ended, but the age of its consequences had just begun. The final, staggering numbers of the day's toll would take time to compile, but the magnitude of the loss was already clear. A total of 2,977 innocent people were killed in the attacks, not including the 19 hijackers. This included 2,753 in New York, 184 at the Pentagon, and 40 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The victims came from more than 90 different countries, making it a truly global tragedy. More than 400 of the dead were first responders, firefighters, police officers and paramedics, who had made the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty. It was the deadliest single attack on American soil in the nation's history. The world that Americans woke up to on the morning of September 12th was fundamentally different from the one they had known just 24 hours before. The attacks had shattered the nation's sense of security and invulnerability, introducing a new and pervasive sense of fear into everyday life. The date, 9/11, was instantly seared into the collective consciousness, becoming a shorthand for a generation-defining trauma, much like December 7th, 1941, had been for a previous generation. The era of post-Cold War peace and optimism was definitively over. The dust that settled over Lower Manhattan was both literal and metaphorical. It was the physical residue of a great national tragedy, but it also represented the end of an era of innocence. The day had begun with a brilliant blue sky and a sense of ordinary calm. It ended under a dark cloud of grief, anger, and uncertainty. The immediate response to the attacks was over, but the long-term response, the wars, the changes to security and society, the ongoing struggle against extremism, and the process of national healing was just beginning. The world had changed forever on a day that started like any other. On September 12, 2001, Americans awoke to a world that felt fundamentally altered. The shock began to curdle into a profound sense of national grief. The familiar routines of American life now seemed like a distant memory. The silence in the sky was deeply unsettling, a constant reminder of the nation's vulnerability. The language of war became commonplace. Flags appeared on every porch, a powerful display of defiance and unity. September 12th was the first full day of life after innocence was lost. The World Trade Center site, now known as Ground Zero, transformed into a scene of solemn recovery. The immense smouldering mountain of debris, the pile, was a treacherous landscape. It was a tangled mass of steel, concrete, and remnants of lives. For the workers, this was a sacred ground demanding reverence. Firefighters, police, ironworkers and volunteers worked tirelessly. The slow, methodical work aimed to recover victims and give them dignity. A call for quiet would ripple across the site when remains were found. A fallen victim would be draped in an American flag and carried out in a solemn procession. This recovery effort was a testament to resilience. They were the first custodians of this wounded ground. Their work represented the best of humanity. In the days following the attacks, a profound wave of grief swept across the United States. It was a collective mourning on a scale not seen in generations. The raw shock gave way to a deeper sense of loss. The endless television coverage created a shared national trauma. Public displays of emotion became commonplace as the nation struggled to process the enormity of its loss. This collective grief found expression in the thousands of makeshift memorials that sprang up spontaneously across the country. On Friday, September 14th, President Bush declared a national day of prayer and remembrance. It was a solemn moment of national unity, broadcast to a grieving populace. For the thousands of families who had lost a loved one, the national tragedy was an intimate and unbearable pain. The wounded nation grieved for the 2,977 individual lives that had been so cruelly extinguished. The attacks of September 11th struck at the heart of the American financial system, triggering a severe economic shockwave. The destruction paralyzed Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq remained closed for the week. When the US markets reopened, they experienced a historic sell-off. The Federal Reserve injected liquidity and cut interest rates to stabilize the markets. The economic impact extended far beyond Wall Street, devastating key sectors like the airline industry. The attacks led to job losses and a sharp economic downturn. The US government spent trillions on wars and homeland security. The economic shockwave was a reminder that national and economic security are linked. The aftermath of September 11th triggered a seismic shift in global geopolitics, fundamentally reordering international relations and ushering in a new era defined by the global war on terror. The unipolar moment of American dominance that had characterized the 1990s gave way to a more complex and honestly contentious world. The United States, under the Bush administration, adopted a new, more muscular and unilateral foreign policy framework, articulated in what became known as the Bush Doctrine. This doctrine asserted the right of the US to act preemptively against perceived threats, a dramatic departure from the Cold War-era policies of containment and deterrence. This new American posture was met with a mixture of support and apprehension from the international community. In the immediate aftermath, there was a powerful wave of global solidarity, with NATO invoking its collective defense clause for the first time in history. This initial unity, however, began to fray as the United States prepared for military action. Long-standing allies in Europe grew wary of America's unilateral tendencies and the broad, open-ended nature of the war on terror. The global consensus against terrorism was strong, but deep divisions soon emerged over the methods and targets of the American response, particularly in the lead-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The attacks also dramatically recentered global attention on the Middle East and Central Asia. Afghanistan, a country largely ignored by the West since the end of the Soviet occupation, was suddenly at the forefront of international concern as the home base of Al-Qaeda and its Taliban protectors. The complex political and religious dynamics of the Muslim world, previously a subject for regional experts, became a central preoccupation for policymakers and the public alike. The events of 9/11 forced a global re-evaluation of the roots of extremism, the role of failed states, and the intricate connections between regional conflicts and international security. This geopolitical transformation had profound and lasting consequences. It led to more than 2 decades of American military engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq, reshaping the political map of the Middle East, and costing trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. It also fueled a global debate about the balance between security and liberty, as many nations enacted new surveillance and anti-terrorism laws that challenged civil liberties. The world that emerged from the rubble of September 11th was one of new alliances, new conflicts, and a new set of global priorities. A transformation that continues to shape our world today. Section 6. The Seeds of War. The Path to Afghanistan. In the aftermath of the attacks, the US government swiftly moved toward military action. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were identified as the culprits. The focus fell on the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which provided them with a safe haven. President Bush addressed Congress, issuing an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over the terrorists. The Taliban refused, and the US prepared for war. Military and intelligence agencies began preparing for war. Special forces were sent to Afghanistan. A diplomatic effort was undertaken to secure support. Operation Enduring Freedom combined American air power with Afghan opposition forces. On October 7th, the US launched airstrikes against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets. The war on terror had begun. Section 7. The birth of the Homeland Security era. The September 11th attacks led to a complete overhaul of America's approach to national security. This birthed Homeland Security with the goal to protect the nation from external threats. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, expanding surveillance powers. Critics warned it eroded civil liberties, sparking debate about freedom versus security. The Department of Homeland Security consolidated 22 federal agencies. For citizens, airport security transformed, and if you see something, say something became a national mantra. The aftermath of 9/11 created a new normal. Section 1. The Echoes of a Single Day. The story of September 11th does not end with the settling of the dust. The events of that morning have echoed through the years, shaping the decades that followed. The impact radiated outwards, touching every aspect of American society and reverberating across the globe. These echoes are the enduring legacy of the nearly 3,000 lives lost. The path to the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq was swift. The global war on terror became the defining foreign policy doctrine. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the passage of the Patriot Act were direct consequences. The cultural echoes are perhaps the most pervasive, as we collectively tried to process the incomprehensible. September 11th cast a long shadow, its echoes a constant reminder of the day the world changed. The legacy of September 11th resides in its immense human cost. The story is a collection of individual stories, each a life cut short. The victims were people from all walks of life, of every race and religion, from over 90 different nations. The act of remembrance has become a sacred national duty. At the sites of the attacks, memorials now stand as permanent places of tribute. Alongside the grief, the story is also one of extraordinary human resilience. It is the story of the first responders, of the passengers on Flight 93 who fought back, and of the ordinary citizens who helped one another. By remembering the victims and celebrating the heroes, we ensure that humanity shines brightest in its aftermath. The attacks of September 11th redefined America's sense of itself. The nation's identity, long rooted in being protected from the world, was shattered. This vulnerability forced a reckoning with security, liberty, and identity. The America that emerged was more guarded and introspective. The Homeland Security era was born, bringing a new architecture of defense. This emphasis on security led to debate about civil liberties. The Patriot Act raised questions about privacy in a digital age. The attacks triggered a painful conversation about American identity and immigration. Suspicion was directed at Muslim and Arab Americans, fueling discrimination. The struggle to uphold American values became a critical challenge. More than 2 decades later, the legacy of September 11th remains unfinished. The world is still grappling with the forces that were unleashed on that day. The wars have officially ended for the United States, but the regions remain deeply unstable. The withdrawal from Afghanistan saw the swift return of the Taliban to power. The ideologies that fueled Al-Qaeda have metastasized, taking on new forms. The geopolitical landscape reshaped by 9/11 continues to evolve. American foreign policy has now given way to a new era of great power competition. Yet the challenges born from the 9/11 era persist. They have simply become part of a more crowded international agenda. Domestically, the political divisions have returned. Debates over immigration, surveillance, and America's role in the world are more polarized than ever. The story of September 11th is therefore not a closed chapter of history. It is a living story whose consequences we continue to navigate. The legacy of 9/11 is unfinished because the world it created is the world we still live in. We began on an ordinary day. We have recounted a story of unimaginable horror, profound loss, and extraordinary courage. The events of September 11th, 2001 serve as a somber reminder of the fragility of peace. The central lesson is one of vigilance, a vigilance against hatred and extremist ideologies, and a vigilance in defense of freedom, tolerance, and an open democratic society. The story of 9/11 compels us to remember our shared humanity. We saw it in the firefighters climbing the stairs, in the passengers of Flight 93, and in the strangers helping strangers. The memory of that unity serves as a powerful reminder that we are stronger together than we are apart. We are left with a story of darkness and light, of despair and hope. A new tower stands in the New York sky, a symbol of defiance and rebirth. It is also a story of rebuilding, of remembrance, and of the unyielding human capacity to endure, to learn, and to look towards a new dawn.